Her name was Elara. She lived alone. She had lived alone since the town of Providence had cast her out. She was 12 years old then. The charge was simple. It was foolishness. It was a stubborn refusal to accept the proper way of things. Her father had been a well digger. Not a modern man with steam-powered drills and iron casings, but a man of hazel branches and quiet listening. He listened to the earth. He said it spoke of water, of life, deep below the reach of man's impatience. He died in the winter of 76, his lungs filled with frost fever, leaving Elara with only 3 things of value: a worn leather satchel, a lame-legged horse named Boulder, and the journals. The journals were his life's work. They were filled with his spidery, precise script. They held charts of rock strata, sketches of root systems, and decades of temperature readings taken from deep within the soil. His final entry, written with a shaking hand, was not a farewell. It was a warning.
"The shallow water is a lie," he had written. "A seasonal gift. The deep water is a promise. The frost is coming. Not a winter, a true frost, a deep frost. It will take the gift and break the proud. Dig below the memory of ice." Elara read it. She believed it. She took her father's tools, a hand-cranked auger, a heavy iron winch, and a collection of reinforced canvas buckets, and she began to dig. She did not dig near the river, where the town's 3 shallow wells provided easy water. She did not dig in the soft loam of the communal pasture. She chose a small, unclaimed plot of granite-stubbled land a half-mile from the last house, a place the townsfolk called the Gray Scrabble. She was 12 years old, and she began to dig a hole. The town watched. At first, it was with a kind of pitying curiosity. The orphan girl, playing at her dead father's strange craft. But the days turned into weeks. The hole grew deeper. The pile of excavated earth and stone grew larger. She rigged the winch, with Boulder the horse circling patiently, to haul the heavy buckets from the depths. The town's pity curdled into irritation. This was not play. This was an obsession. It was unnatural. Mayor Thorne, a man whose family had founded Providence on the principle of sensible, modern progress, paid her a visit. He stood at the edge of the growing pit, his polished shoes dusty. "Child," he said, his voice thick with strained patience, "what is the meaning of this?" Elara, her face smudged with clay, looked up from the bottom of the 20-foot hole. "I'm digging a well, Mayor Thorne." "We have wells," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the town. "Good wells, productive wells." "They are shallow wells," she replied, her voice small but clear. "My father's journals say a deep frost is coming. The shallow water will freeze." The mayor blinked. He looked at the pile of granite chips she had painstakingly chipped away. He looked at the thin girl and the old horse. He nearly laughed. "Your father," he said, choosing his words carefully, "was a man of eccentric theories. Providence is a modern town. We rely on engineering, not folk tales." "This isn't a folk tale," she insisted. "It's geology. It's about the deep earth, the heat below the frost." "It is a public nuisance," the mayor declared, his tone hardening. "This is undeeded land. You are digging a dangerous hole for no reason. You are to cease this foolishness at once. Fill it in." Elara did not answer. She simply turned back to her work. The mayor's face flushed with anger. The town council met the next day. They passed an ordinance.
the Providence Public Safety and Tidiness Act of 1878. It forbade unauthorized excavation. It declared her project a hazard. It declared her a vagrant. Because she would not stop digging, they exiled her. She was given 1 day to gather her meager possessions, her father's tools, the journals, the horse. She was to remain outside the town limits, on the Gray Scrabble, which they mockingly deeded to her for the sum of $1, a fee the mayor paid himself with a flourish. She was no longer their concern. She was the girl who dug. And so her solitary labor began in earnest. For the next 10 years, Elara dug. She lived in a small, rough-hewn shanty she built herself, banked with sod for insulation. Her world shrank to the circle of the sky above her well, the patient breathing of her horse, and the spidery ink in her father's journals. The town of Providence moved on. It grew. A wealthy builder, Silas Croft, constructed a new town hall with a magnificent clock tower. He was a man who believed in surfaces, in paint, and in the power of things that looked impressive. He also invested in the town's water system.
Why rely on old-fashioned bucket wells? He argued at a town meeting.
Progress demands efficiency. He financed a new central pumping station, a marvel of iron gears and steam power, connected by a network of iron pipes to a new, wider, but still reassuringly shallow well. It was only 30 feet deep, easy to service, easy to access. The town celebrated its inauguration with a parade. Mr. Gable, an engineer from a city in the east, was hired to oversee the project. He was a man of slide rules and calculations. He dismissed Elara's distant, ongoing project with a wave of his hand. Geologically unsound, he declared to anyone who would listen at the general store. The fool girl is digging past the water table. Every foot she goes down now is a foot wasted. She's chasing a dry myth. The mockery took root and blossomed. Her project became known as Elara's Folly. Sometimes, on Sundays, families would ride their buggies out to the Gray Scrabble as a form of entertainment. They would watch the lone figure and the old horse, circling, hauling up bucket after bucket of rock and clay. The pile of tailings grew into a small mountain. The well became a dark, terrifying throat, disappearing into the earth. A new phrase entered the town's lexicon. To do something pointless, to waste one's time on an impossible task, was digging for dust. I spent all morning trying to fix that wagon wheel, a farmer might say. Pure digging for dust. Elara heard the laughter on the wind. She ignored it. She had the journals. She had her work. The first 40 feet were soil and clay. Easy work, relatively. Then she hit shale. For 2 years, she chipped away at the brittle, layered rock. The sound of her chisel and hammer was a faint, metallic heartbeat from the depths. She passed the 50-foot mark, the depth of the deepest frost ever recorded in the region's history. Her father's journal noted it with a red line. The memory of ice ends here, he had written. She kept digging. At 80 feet, she hit a shelf of solid granite. The town, hearing of it from a hunter who had passed by, let out a collective sigh of vindicated amusement. The folly was finished. She had hit the bedrock of the world. But her father had prepared for this. His journals contained detailed instructions, sketches of star drills and feather wedges. The process was brutally slow. Drill a hole, pack it with wedges, pound them until the rock groaned and split, haul up the fractured pieces. It took her a month to get through a single foot of granite. It took her 3 years to break through the 20-foot thick shelf. She was a young woman now, no longer a girl. Her hands were calloused and strong. Her face was weathered, her eyes accustomed to the dark. She spoke so little that her voice grew rough and unused. Her only companion was Boulder, who was now grey in the muzzle and slow in his steps. But his loyalty never wavered. He was the silent confidant to her solitary mission. She talked to him as she worked, reading passages from the journals aloud. "See, Boulder?" she would whisper, her breath fogging in the cool air rising from the shaft. "Father says the pressure builds here. The water is trapped under the granite, warmed by the earth's heart. He calls it the deep aquifer, the permanent water." 100 feet. 110. She passed through the granite into a layer of compacted gravel, a subterranean riverbed millions of years old. The air from the well shaft changed. It no longer smelled of cold stone. It smelled of damp, of life, of something ancient and pure. Her father's journal for this depth had a single triumphant entry. Here, the promise. At 120 feet, her auger broke through. There was no sudden gush of water, no dramatic flood, just a subtle change in resistance, a wet, sucking sound. She lowered a bucket. It came up, heavy. It came up, full of cold, clear water. She wept. For the first time in 10 years, she allowed herself to cry. She had reached her father's promise. But the work was not done. Reaching the water was not the same as securing it. For the next 2 years, she painstakingly lined the well shaft with flat stones, fitting them together like a puzzle, creating a stable, permanent tunnel to the deep earth. She built a small, sturdy well house over the opening, with a new, more efficient winch and a roof thick with sod. She was 24 years old. Her well was 120 feet deep, lined with stone, and it produced a steady, inexhaustible supply of water that was cool in the summer and, crucially, never froze in the winter. It was the year 1888. The town of Providence barely remembered she existed. She was a local legend, a cautionary tale parents told their children about the dangers of stubbornness. The Ice Widow, some called her now, for she was wedded to her cold hole in the ground. That autumn, the signs began. Elara, attuned to the rhythms of the Gray Scrabble, noticed them first. The squirrels were frantic, stripping the pine trees bare, their caches overflowing. Flocks of birds that normally wintered in the valley flew south, a great, panicked exodus that darkened the sky for 3 days. The deer came down from the high country weeks early, their coats unusually thick. There was a strange silence that fell with the dusk. Not peace, but a dead, waiting stillness. The air tasted of iron. Her father's old barometer, which she kept polished on a shelf, began a slow, steady plunge, unlike anything recorded in his journals. She knew what it meant. The deep frost was coming. She spent a week in quiet, methodical preparation. She hauled extra cords of firewood into her small cabin. She checked the seals on her windows, packing them with moss and clay. She brought Boulder into a reinforced lean-to attached to the well house, ensuring he was sheltered from the wind. She filled a dozen large barrels with water from her well, a reserve inside her home, just in case. A thought flickered in her mind. She should warn them. She should ride into Providence and tell Mayor Thorne, tell them all what was coming. The thought died as quickly as it came. She pictured their faces, the pity, the scorn, the knowing smiles. The mad girl from the Folly, raving about the sky falling. They had exiled her for her wisdom once. They would only laugh at her for it again. Her warning would be just another story to tell about the Ice Widow's madness. They had made their choice 10 years ago, when they chose their shallow wells and their proud iron pumps. She had made hers.
On the morning of November 17th, 1888, she awoke to a world transformed. The silence was absolute. A thick, crystalline frost coated every surface, turning the world into a sculpture of glass. The sun was a pale, helpless disk in a white sky. Then the wind began. It did not howl. It was a physical blow from the north, a solid wall of cold that seemed to suck the very breath from the air. The temperature plummeted. 10 degrees, 0, 20 below. Elara stayed inside. She stoked her small wood stove, the crackle of the flames a cheerful defiance against the frozen world. The sound of the storm was a distant, muffled roar, the thick sod walls of her cabin and well house absorbing its fury. She was safe. She was warm. She had water. In Providence, the catastrophe was swift and total. The first thing to fail was Silas Croft's proud pumping station. The iron pipes holding the cold, shallow water contracted in the brutal freeze. With a series of sharp reports like rifle shots, they split their seams. The great steam engine, its boiler lines freezing faster than they could be heated, cracked its main housing. By noon on the first day, the town's modern water system was destroyed. Panic set in. The people rushed to the old town wells, the ones they had abandoned. They lowered their buckets on frozen ropes. The buckets hit the bottom with a dull thud. Solid ice. The wells, all 30 feet deep, were frozen through. The river was a road of grey ice 2 feet thick. There was no liquid water in Providence. The cold deepened. 30 below. 40 below. It was a thing of mythic violence, a cold that killed. Windows shattered from the thermal stress. The wood of houses groaned and popped, nails pulled loose from frozen timbers. The magnificent clock on Silas Croft's town hall stopped at 3:17 a.m. on the second day, its gears seized by ice. Livestock froze to death in their barns. People huddled in their homes, burning their furniture to stay warm, their throats parched with a desperate thirst. They tried to melt snow, but it was a slow, fuel-hungry process, and their fuel was running out. By the third day, the town was dying. It was Mr. Gable, the engineer, who thought of her first. His youngest son was sick with a fever, his small body burning up, crying for water that did not exist. Gable, the man of science and reason, was reduced to a primal fear. And in his fear, he remembered the joke, the Folly, the ice widow, the girl who dug for a decade. He remembered his own smug pronouncements, geologically unsound, chasing a dry myth. What if she had not been a fool? What if he had been? The thought was a sliver of ice in his gut, but it was also a sliver of hope. He wrapped himself in every piece of clothing he owned and stepped out into the killing cold. The half-mile walk to the Gray Scrabble was a journey through a frozen hell. The wind tore at him, and the air seared his lungs. He stumbled, fell, and crawled the last 100 yards, his mind numb with cold and despair. He saw it then, a small, snow-dusted cabin, a sturdy well house, and from the stone chimney, a thin, impossible ribbon of grey smoke rising straight into the frozen air. Life. He reached the door and collapsed against it, his knocks no more than a weak scratching. The door opened. Elara stood there, framed by the warm, yellow light of her home. She looked at the half-frozen man on her doorstep, his face a mask of frost and frozen tears. She recognized him. The engineer, the man who had called her a fool. He tried to speak,
but his lips were cracked and frozen. "Water," he croaked, the word a painful rasp. "My boy. Sick." Elara looked at him for a long moment. There was no triumph in her eyes, no "I told you so." There was only a quiet, profound stillness. She stepped back and held the door open.
"Come in," she said, her voice soft from disuse.
She sat him by the fire. She gave him a dipper of water. It was the sweetest thing he had ever tasted. It was life itself. She said nothing of his mockery, nothing of the past. She filled 2 large canteens from a barrel in the corner. "For your son," she said, pressing them into his trembling hands. "Boil it first." He could only nod, his throat thick with a shame so deep it burned more than the cold. He staggered back to town, a ghost returning from the dead, carrying salvation in his hands. The sight of the canteens, the impossible, sloshing sound of liquid water, sent a shockwave through Providence. The story spread from house to frozen house. Elara's folly was not a folly. It was the only water left in the world. The procession began that afternoon. It was a pilgrimage of the humbled. Families, wrapped in blankets, pulling sleds with empty buckets and barrels, their faces etched with desperation and awe.
They walked the half-mile path their buggies had once taken for Sunday amusement. They walked to the home of the woman they had exiled. Elara was waiting. She had opened the doors to her well house. The winch was ready. One by one, they came forward, not daring to meet her eyes. They lowered their buckets into the dark, narrow shaft and brought them up, dripping with life. Elara stood watch, a silent, solitary figure. She did not ration. She did not demand payment or apology. She simply let them take what they needed to survive. She became their leader without saying a word. She showed them how to use the water efficiently. Her well became the new heart of the town, a place of quiet, desperate work. The last to arrive were Mayor Thorne and Silas Croft. They came on the 5th day, their pride finally shattered by the cries of their thirsty families. Silas Croft, the man of surfaces, his fine coat now tattered, his face gaunt. His magnificent town hall was a frozen tomb. His modern pump was a monument to his own arrogance. Mayor Thorne, the man of sensible progress, looked old and broken. They stood before Elara, their empty buckets in their hands. They did not speak. They could not. What could they say? Elara looked at them, the 2 men who had been the architects of her exile. She simply nodded toward the well. They lowered their buckets, their hands shaking, and joined the silent, humbled queue. The Great Freeze lasted for 3 weeks. For 3 weeks, the town of Providence survived on a single thread of water, drawn from the well of the woman they had wronged. When the temperature finally rose, when the thaw began, the town was not the same. It was broken, but it had survived, and it knew who it had to thank. A week after the freeze broke, a town meeting was called. It was held in the damaged, unheated church, the only public building still mostly intact. The entire town was there. Elara was asked to attend. She sat in the front pew, alone, her worn work clothes a stark contrast to the Sunday best of the townsfolk. She was not their prisoner this time. She was their judge. Mayor Thorne, Silas Croft, and Mr. Gable walked to the front and faced the silent assembly. It was the mayor who spoke first, his voice heavy with a humility he had never known. He looked directly at Elara. "I stood on the edge of your work 10 years ago," he began, his voice cracking. "I called it foolishness. I championed what I called progress. I championed convenience. I led this council in casting you out because your truth was uncomfortable. He took a deep breath. My progress froze and cracked. My convenience failed us all. Your truth, your father's truth, gave us water. It gave us life. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the townspeople. You were right, he said, his voice ringing with the clarity of a broken man. And we were wrong. Silas Croft stepped forward next. My buildings nearly became our tombs, he said, his voice a low rasp. I built with pride, for show. You built with wisdom, for survival. I mocked your hole in the ground, while I erected a hollow shell. My pump is a wreck of rusted iron. Your well is a miracle. He looked at Elara, his eyes filled with a shame that could never be erased. You were right. We were wrong. Finally, Mr. Gable, the engineer, stood before her. I am a man of science, he said. I believed in my numbers, in my books. I dismissed your work because it did not fit my formulas. I called your father's knowledge a myth. He shook his head slowly. But the earth is older than our books. Its science is deeper than our understanding. You listened to the earth. We listened only to our own pride. He looked at her, his expression one of complete surrender. My son is alive because of you. This town is alive because of you. You were right. We were wrong. The three men stood there, their confession hanging in the cold air. The town was silent, waiting. All eyes were on Elara. She rose slowly from the pew. She walked to the front, her footsteps echoing in the quiet church. She looked at the faces before her, the people who had scorned her, laughed at her, and then depended on her. Her expression was not one of forgiveness, nor of anger. It was one of profound, weary wisdom. Pride is a poor foundation, she said, her voice clear and steady. It will not hold up a roof in a storm, and it will not draw water from a frozen well. She looked at the three men. Your apology is accepted, not for my sake, but for yours. Survival is not about being right. It is about being prepared. It is about listening to the truths the world tells you, not the stories you tell yourselves. She paused, letting her words settle. I will teach you, she said finally. I will show you how to find the deep water. I will share my father's journals. But you must be willing to learn the lesson. You must be willing to dig. That day marked the rebirth of Providence. The town did not just rebuild, it transformed. They abandoned their shallow wells forever. Under Elara's guidance, they began to dig new wells, deep wells, using the methods outlined in her father's journals. The work was hard. It was slow. It was methodical. But no one complained. The phrase, digging for dust, died out. In its place, a new term was born. To show great foresight, to prepare diligently for a future no one else can see, was to dig an Elara. He stored enough grain for 3 winters, one farmer would say of another, with deep respect. He dug an Elara. Elara herself never moved back into the town. She stayed in her small cabin on the Gray Scrabble, by the well that had saved them all. She never married. She never sought a family. She had her work, her father's legacy, and a quiet, solitary peace. She became the town's sage, its revered teacher. People would make the walk to her home not for water, but for advice. She taught them how to read the sky, how to understand the soil, how to listen to the silence of the seasons. She taught them the difference between the pride of surfaces and the wisdom of depths. She lived for 50 more years. She saw generations born who knew the story of the Great Freeze not as a memory, but as a founding legend. She died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 74, a respected, solitary sage. The entire town, and people from settlements miles around, came to her funeral. They did not bury her in the town cemetery. They laid her to rest on the Gray Scrabble, beside her old horse, Boulder, within sight of the well house. The town commissioned a bronze plaque. They fixed it to the stone wall of the well house, which was now known as the Founder's Well. The plaque did not bear a flowery epitaph. It bore the simple, profound lesson she had taught them, the lesson her father had written in his journal so many years before. It read, "The shallow water is a lie. The deep water is a promise. Listen to the earth. Respect the frost. Dig below the memory of ice."